What do you think the future of the U.S. military looks like? It's gone through many iterations. You were in charge. You helped lead a transformation of the U.S. military. What does it look like for us in the future, in your opinion, if you had a silver ball?
I think we have yet to decide who we are and what role we should be playing in this century. When I was at the Pentagon, I read a book that was important to me. It was Bridget Haas's book called The Reluctant Sheriff. And that's how I wanted to conduct I wanted to be a sheriff, but a reluctant one. I did not want to put young people like Sully and men and women in harm's way unless we really had to. There was a compelling need to ask him to sacrifice his life for a cause. So I was pretty reluctant, and we were very lucky, and I didn't lose anybody during combat until the very end, when there was a suicide attack upon the USS Cole. But prior to that time, we managed to avoid casualties for the most part. Had training exercise casualties, but actual warfare was pretty limited. Then came President Clinton, President Bush, I should say, fallen President Clinton, and 9/11, different attitude. And I like to kind of, not joke about it, but we went from being a reluctant sheriff to the Texas Terminator. And we were going to go out and we were going to preemptively attack countries before they could attack us again. And so went into Iraq, and then first Afghanistan, then Iraq. I had some questions about the wisdom of that, frankly, because when we were in office, we said Saddam Hussein really doesn't pose a significant threat to us because we had no-fly zones in the north, no-fly zones in the south. We were decimating, and decimated his air defense system. So he had nothing left, basically. But we were watching him and saying if he moves toward Saudi Arabia, moves toward Israel, we will move in there with up to 500,000 troops. That was our plan. Well, new administration said, old thinking, we can do it with a much smaller group. And we could, and we did. But the question is, what happens after, shock and awe? What came next? And what came next was 14 years of trying to manage a country where we removed much of the Sunni leadership. And they're fighting the Shia now leadership. So that's the Texas Terminator period of our time. And then you have Barack Obama coming now and saying, well, maybe it's time that we perhaps lead from behind. We become part of an international posse. And sometimes we'll be out front, sometimes behind, but we're part of a greater group. And I don't think we have resolved to this day what we want to be, who we want to be. Because even the Republican Party, you have debate taking place. You've got libertarians on the right saying, let's disengage. It's time to come home and do a little nation building right here. And you can see the need for nation building at home. We've got bridges in Washington that are crumbling. They shut down Memorial Bridge. You've got infrastructure needs all over this country. You take the train up from Washington to New York, it's a stagecoach. By comparison to what's going on in other countries in terms of rapid train service. So we've got a lot of work to do at home, and there are a lot of folks, including Republicans on the right and Democrats on the left, that say it's time to come home. I think that's a mistake. I think we have to remain engaged. I think we have to be forward deployed in a number of countries. Because when you are not seen, and people don't feel you are there to protect them as well as your own interests, they lose confidence in your willingness to sacrifice for them. So it's in our national security interest to be engaged. It's important that we're still in South Korea. It's important that we still have forces in Japan. It's important that we try to reinforce our presence now in the Baltics as a result of what President Putin is doing. And when countries suspect that you're pulling back, now let's just look at the Middle East. What is the signal we have sent in the Middle East? We pulled out of Iraq entirely. We're back in a little bit now. We were pulling entirely out of Afghanistan, though we slowed that down. We didn't get involved in Syria, although we pledged to do something about the use of chemical weapons. We're not in Ukraine, and we're negotiating now with Iran. But the perception is that we're retrenching, we're pulling back. And so when that happens, other countries make calculations in their own interest about who's going to be with them. Is it going to be the United States? And what are the signals that we're sending? Well, they're confusing. They're mixed. As a result of mixed signals, then they have more doubt about you, less reliability in you. So that's, I think, and that also translates to other parts of the world. It sends a signal to President Putin. He can make a calculation saying, I'm not so sure the United States is willing to take me on. I can take Crimea. I can even destabilize Ukraine. I might even go into the Baltics and make a little mischief there. And what is the U.S. likely to do about it, if anything? So he's pursuing his own interests. China can say, yeah, you talked a great game about this pivot or rebalancing the Asia-Pacific region, but we're doing what? We're looking at your budget. And your budget shows it's going down. And you can't maintain all of this pre-positioning and equipment that you keep talking about. So they make their own calculations about how far they can push in terms of extending their perimeter and their area of influence. So we haven't decided where we want to be and what we want to be. And now we face something called sequester again. Sequester has been devastating to the U.S. military budget because we had across-the-board cuts, not only in the military but in our civilian side as well. And this is absurd. It's obscene for a country like the United States. You think about this. If you have 535 people, let's say it's 5 times the number of people here, you say, I want you 535 people to make a decision. Can you come up with a plan that will cut $1.2 trillion over 10 years out of our federal budget? You say 535, probably more difficult to get an agreement. Okay, I'll just take the 12 in these 2 first rows. We're all going to get together, 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats, and let's sit down. Do you think we can figure out a proposal for $1.2 trillion over 10 years? Answer was no. They couldn't come to an agreement with 12 people. And so they put in place a sequester or a guillotine that came down and says, fine, we'll just take $1.2 trillion out across the board. That's no way to run a country. It's no way to run a military. You can't do that. And so you had poor Chuck Hagel taking over. He goes into office. The first thing he's got to do is cut $36 billion out of his budget in 6 months with no discretion. So that tells you something about why the system isn't working as it should. So we have to get rid of the sequester. We've had 2 years of relief, but it goes back into effect in 2016. And when you start doing that, people don't see what takes place. When you have cuts like that, we had a number of air wings that couldn't fly. We had to sit them on the ground. Their pilots couldn't train. The mechanics couldn't work on the planes, etc. What happens to those 12 the pilots of those aircraft? They can't fly. And if you call them and say, we've got to go to war, they can't go. They're not ready. So readiness starts to go down. We train every day. That's what makes us as good as we are, is training every single day. So you stop the training, you stop the capability, you reduce your efficiencies, and over time you will hollow out your military. So those are things that most people don't relate to. They're saying, you spend too much money on defense. We've got other issues and other requirements, and so it's time for Defense Department to take a haircut. And that's the approach taken by a number of people today, and some coming in see as their major role, no more spending, no new taxes, no compromise. So that's where we are. And when you say no compromise, well, that's pretty anti-democratic, right? Because anytime you have more than one person in a room, you've got to make a compromise. As the lawyers say, my right to swing my fist stops where your chin begins. So we have to make compromises, but compromise is a word that has been poll tested to reflect weakness, lack of principle, and compromise is the essence of democratic systems, but that's where we are.